If you've ever felt out of place in a life that looks fine on paper, this video might explain why. Not because you're special, but because your path doesn't work the way most do. There's a specific pattern that shows up in some people's lives. Not success, not talent, not luck. A pattern of misfit. You try to follow the expected route, the normal milestones, the reasonable goals, the version of life that works for others. And somehow it never fully clicks. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly off. You adapt, you make it work, you do what you're supposed to do. But something in you stays unconvinced. This isn't rebellion. It's not a desire to be different. It's the quiet sense that you're being shaped by experiences that don't allow you to settle. People like you often get misunderstood. You're told you're too sensitive, too intense, too distracted, or that you're overthinking everything. But the truth is simpler. Your life keeps interrupting you because you're not meant to sleepwalk through it. The path you're on doesn't reward comfort. It rewards awareness. That's why things fall apart for you earlier than they do for others. That's why shortcuts never quite work. Why pretending costs you more. Why ignoring your inner signals creates immediate friction. This video isn't about being chosen. It's about recognizing a pattern that keeps selecting you for wake-up calls. And if you've felt that pattern your whole life, stay. We're going to look at the real signs, not fantasies, not labels, that indicate your life is structured for depth, not ease. And once you see them clearly, a lot of your past will finally make sense. You probably recognized yourself already, not in the words, in the pauses between them. Because this isn't something you learn about yourself. It's something you've been quietly living with for a long time. You've always felt things a little earlier than others. You notice shifts in people before they admit them to themselves. You sense when something is no longer true long before it falls apart. And because of that, you've spent much of your life waiting for the outside to catch up to what you already feel inside. That waiting creates a specific kind of loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but from being ahead of your own life. You've probably questioned yourself for it, wondered if you're imagining things, if you're too sensitive, if you should just relax and stop reading so much into everything. But here's the pattern most people miss. When you ignore that inner signal, your life doesn't let you drift peacefully. It interrupts you. Plans unravel. Situations collapse early. Relationships force honesty faster than you expected. Not to punish you, to keep you awake. People on an ordinary path can coast for years on momentum alone. You can't. Not because you're better, but because your nervous system doesn't tolerate misalignment. What others call fine, your body registers as friction. So you adjust, you leave, you start again. And every time you do, you lose a little more patience for pretending this is random. This is where the confusion starts. Because the internet calls this being chosen, being special, having a destiny. But that language misses the truth. You weren't chosen for privilege. You were shaped for responsibility. Responsibility to notice, responsibility to feel, responsibility to not numb yourself just because others can. That's heavier than it sounds, and it explains why you've never fully envied the lives that look easier. Something in you knows you wouldn't survive in them. Not because they're bad, but because they would put you to sleep. If this is landing, It's because you're tired of trying to fit into explanations that don't account for how intensely you experience being alive. Stay with this. In the next part, we're going to talk about the signs that show up after you stop doubting yourself, the ones no one glamorizes, the ones that quietly confirm you were never meant to blend in, but to stay conscious. And that changes everything about how you live with yourself, and this is where it becomes unmistakable. Once you stop questioning whether you're imagining it, a different pattern emerges. You realize your life hasn't been random at all. The interruptions weren't failures. The endings weren't mistakes. The restlessness wasn't immaturity. They were corrections. Every time you tried to settle into something that asked you to go numb, something intervened. Sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, but always precisely. You may have noticed that comfort never lasts long for you. The moment things become too predictable, your energy drops. Not boredom, dullness, as if part of you shuts down when there's nothing left to stay alert for. That's not ambition, that's awareness needing friction. You weren't built to maintain structures, you were built to notice when they stop being true. And that comes with a cost. You don't get the luxury of unconscious loyalty. You don't get to lie to yourself for long. You don't get to disappear into routines that don't ask anything of your presence. When you try, your body reacts first. Tightness, fatigue, a quiet anxiety that has no clear source. That's your signal system doing its job. Most people can ignore those signals for decades. You can't. And that's where the loneliness deepens. Because you can't fully explain this to others without sounding dramatic or ungrateful. So you learn to stay quiet about it, to carry it privately, to keep moving without naming why. But here's the truth most people never hear. This path isn't about being exceptional. It's about being unable to disconnect. Unable to disconnect from what you feel, from what you sense, from what you know when something is off. That makes life more demanding and more real. If you've stayed with this video this long, you're not looking for validation. You're looking for relief from having to doubt yourself. And that relief doesn't come from being told you're special. It comes from recognizing that the way you've been living finally makes sense. In the next part, we'll talk about what happens when you stop resisting this role and start living with it instead of against it. Not how to become something new. How to stop exhausting yourself by trying to be ordinary. And here's the moment where everything becomes quiet. Because if this is you, you already know there was never a choice. You didn't choose this path. You were unable to abandon it. Unable to become small enough to fit into a life that required numbness. Unable to forget what you notice. Unable to unfeel what's true. That's why you've spent so much time alone even when surrounded by people. Why your life feels intense without looking dramatic from the outside. Why you've never fully belonged anywhere that required you to stop listening inward. This isn't destiny, it's consequence. The consequence of staying conscious when it would have been easier to sleep. And no one tells you this part. There is grief in that. Grief for the simple life you could never keep. Grief for the ease you watched others have. Grief for the versions of yourself that tried to stay, tried to settle, tried to pretend. Let that grief be real, because it proves something important. You didn't fail at being ordinary. You outgrew it before it could hold you. And once that's seen clearly, the search for validation ends. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start recognizing, Nothing was ever wrong. I was just awake in a world that rewards sleep. This channel isn't here to crown you. It's here to tell you the truth most people never hear. If you're built like this, you don't get to live on autopilot. But you do get something else: depth, precision, a life that feels real from the inside. And that's heavier, but it's also honest. If this hit you, don't rush to explain it. Just notice how still you feel right now. That stillness isn't emptiness, it's recognition. And recognition is irreversible. I'll see you in the next video.